Welcome back to Where You Live on Shaw TV. I am here with Jamie Nichols, who is the roast master for the Crantz Roasting Company, located right here in Thunder Bay. We're lucky to have you on the show. How are you doing, Jamie?
Excellent.
Fantastic. Now, you've gone over with Janice to kind of how you got into it and things like that, and coffee, what it is. Now we're going to talk about the roasting process. Tell me, what does it mean to roast coffee bean, which is actually a cherry?
Correct. So the coffee cherry is at origin, so in Kenya or Guatemala or Colombia, is a cherry. It is picked when it's ripe. It is then processed on site, so you take the hull off of it and then processed in different ways, and eventually it is brought down to a green bean, which looks kind of like this. So they're little tiny green beans.
Yummy.
And these are very, very dense, and they're about 10% water or so. And those are eventually brought up to us here in Canada through a couple of different suppliers. And then we start the roast process.
And what does it mean to roast a bean? Because I know there's different stages, and I've heard that the longer you roast it, the less caffeine there is. Is that true?
That's a bit of a, well, it is not exactly a myth. It is true that there is less caffeine, but in terms of the effect on the human body, it's so negligible that you don't need to worry about that.
Interesting.
So yeah, basically roasting is taking a green coffee bean like this and bringing it up in temperature over the course of about 10 to 15 minutes to about 200 degrees Celsius. And then what happens at a certain point in the roasting process is you'll hear it popping, very much like popcorn. So you'll hear it snapping and start to crackle. And that's something called first crack. And that's really when the really interesting things start happening with the bean. The sugars start to caramelize, everything starts getting a little bit tastier and roastier. And then over the next two to 4 minutes, the coffee is doing something called developing. So you're actually developing the flavors, and you're trying to find that mix between the roasting and the sugars and the caramelization of sugars and so on, until it gets to something called second crack. And second crack is when the entire structure of the bean is starting to change, and you'll hear it crack again. It's a much higher pitched crack, at which point you're actually starting to scorch the outside of the bean. Some roasts will take you past second crack and beyond. Some people really like it like that. We here at Crantz actually tend to not get that far.
So is it an audible thing, or is it a visual thing?
It's an audible thing. Inside the roaster, you can't exactly see a whole lot, but you will hear it snap and crackle as it goes through these different stages.
Would you nibble on it, like on a coffee bean, to figure out where you're at, or is it just you hear it and you're like, that's where I want it to be?
Yeah, well, you hear it, and what'll happen is you can actually pull out this thing called a trier, and you can actually pull out little samples of the beans, and mostly it's done off of sound and smell.
Smell?
Yeah, the beans are about 200 degrees Celsius at that point, so yeah, you can't really put it in your mouth. Though I've heard people that have done it and it's been kind of spongy because it is really, really hot. They also burn their mouths, so I'm not really inclined to do that.
And then there go the taste buds.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, it's so interesting. So how do you become a roast master? What does that mean?
I'm not sure that it's a certified term of any kind. I think it's just a matter of I'm the only one that does it here at Crantz Roasting Company, so I think it's I'm the master of it.
And you've been doing it for a while now, a couple of years.
I've been roasting. I started roasting a long time ago, but I've only been doing it with this company for about 4 years now, and only full time for the last year and a half or so.
Awesome, that's so cool. So when you're doing the roasting part of it, because when you go into a coffee shop, you're like, oh, light roast, dark roast. Is that I'm assuming that's dependent on how long it stays in the roaster?
Absolutely. So there's a whole bunch of different variables that can happen with coffee roasting. It's how fast you get it to the end temperature. If you put a lot of heat at the start, put a lot of heat at the end. If you roast it longer, roast it shorter. There's a whole bunch of different variables. How much coffee you put in there, how fast the drum is moving, how much air you put into it. It's a very complicated process and there's a lot of different variables. But so when a dark roast is typically when you've gone beyond second crack. And that's when you get into a lot of that bitter char flavored. So
gotcha. So when you're looking at when I'm getting an Americano or something like that, that's with espresso beans,
No
Or-
such thing as an espresso bean.
No, right, espresso roast? Is that what it would be then?
There's some people
What is
market it. Some people have an espresso roast. It's something that is specifically designed for an espresso. A lot of the clients that I work with actually just use whatever beans they want of mine to run through their espresso maker. Currently, I am experimenting with a straight up Burundi. So there's a subtle difference between a blend and a single origin. So I'm using only one origin. Blends typically round out profiles, and they sometimes work better or worse with espresso. For me, I'm working with single origin. And
Now, when you're, I'm going to flip-flop around here, but when you're looking at the beans and you're roasting the beans, does it matter where it comes from? Because you know how wine has like the different notes. Coffee has a little scale. If you look at the package, usually in the grocery store, it'll have like a little index telling you where it sits on the notes or whatever. I don't exactly know the term, but what does that depend on the bean or the roast of the bean?
The answer is yes.
Yes.
Coffee, just like wine, just like a grape has, it has something called terroir. So it is flavors that are imparted on it by the place that it's grown. So coffee is very much influenced by where it's grown. It's then influenced by how it's processed, and then it's influenced by how it's stored. Then it's influenced by how it's roasted, and then it's influenced by how it's brewed. So there are a lot of different variables along the way to making a good cup of coffee.
So there's so much to learn, and we don't have that kind of time here on Shaw TV, but I wish we could talk forever. You're going to be talking to Janice coming up here about, picking up the coffee and all that kind of stuff. So I'll let her get into that. But I've got a really interesting question I want to ask you when we sit down and talk about the brewing process. It just came to me. And I'll leave it at that. So keep watching Where You Live on Shaw TV.